Welcome to Minnesota Legislative Report, our region's longest-running public affairs program. Lawmakers from northeastern Minnesota are joining us today for a recap of the week's activities at the state capitol. This is your opportunity to call or email your legislative questions and have them answered live on the air. Minnesota Legislative Report starts now.
Hello and welcome to Minnesota Legislative Report. I'm your host, Tony Sertich. The 2023 legislative session is down to its final days, and lawmakers have been working long hours, including a House floor session yesterday. Conference committees are working out the details of major spending bills and sending them back to the final votes on the House and Senate floor. Today is your final opportunity to call or email your questions for lawmakers who represent you. The phone number is on your screen, or you can always email us a question to ask@pbsnorth.org. Joining us in studio is Representative Natalie Zeleznikar, a Republican from Friedenberg Township, representing House District 3B. Welcome, Representative Zeleznikar.
Thank you.
Yeah. And Senator Jason Rarick, a Republican, is joining us for the first time this year. From Pine City, he represents Senate District 11. Welcome, Senator Rarick.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Great to have you both here. So we are 1 week away and 1 day from the end of the legislative session. Senator Rarick, this is your first time on the show. Representative Zeleznikar, it's your third time this year on the show already. So we'll let you start here. What do you think about the pace of the legislative session and just overall how it's going for you?
Yeah, this year has been different than any of the 9 that I've been there. It's working, they're moving at a pretty quick pace. Usually, back in January, February, you're hearing from state agencies, hearing, especially for, the new members, what the agencies do. We had a number of bills that came forward right away, some pretty big bills. Didn't do a lot of that agency stuff, and so the pace has been pretty unreal. And even people who have been around the Capitol for 30 plus years are saying they've never seen anything like it. So, I thought I'd have time to get up to speed on a new issue area, the Education Finance Committee this year, and it just didn't happen. I was having to do that while we were doing all those other bills. So it's been way different than anything I've experienced.
Representative Zeleznikar, you've been on the show a few times. It's your first time, so you have nothing to compare it to except maybe your expectations. And so what has been the biggest surprise for you in serving your first year in the legislature?
I think the biggest surprise has been coming to the end. Now we're in May, ready to close up, the first year, for me the first year, and to see that the minority party is not being included in the conference committees. And that was surprising to me because the whole theme was One Minnesota. And so even though the minority party might be 48% of the people, I think it's important that they are present, and they haven't been in some really key areas for public safety and the energy bill, and there's just a long list of them. So I think that's the biggest disappointment, to be in surprise that would happen.
And for our viewers, the conference committee is when a bill passes both the House and the Senate. They need to agree on it, and so they select 5 members from each body, and then they're the ones who hammer out the agreement and then send it back for a final vote. And that's where we're at right now for a whole host of the budget bills and some of the other bills that we'll be talking about today with your questions. And so first question out the gate, and we're going to start with you, Representative Zeleznikar, and you'll know why in 1 second. Why hasn't there been more attention and funding for nursing homes and long-term care in the budget proposals? I'm aware that many nursing homes are deep financial trouble, and several have closed or on the verge of closing. This is Jenny emailing in. Representative Zeleznikar, you serve on the committee. This is your background of your career. Can you talk about this issue?
I think it's been a very disappointing thing for every Minnesotan. I mean, we got the largest group of aging people, and why are we not funding nursing homes is a very good question. I've been asking that in every chance I have to speak on the House floor. Why do we have money for zoos? Why do we have a $146 million train coming to Duluth? Why are we doing all these things, adding new government programs when we aren't taking care of the fundamentals, which should be the people that built the state and the country, which are the seniors, who are the frailest, most vulnerable in nursing homes. And I think it's because it's just this lack of understanding of what it really takes to run 24-hour operations. This understanding that everybody's just thriving and they're all wealthy and they're all doing great. And that's just simply not the facts, and we're seeing closures every week. And the system that nursing homes are reimbursed on is an 18 to 24 month delay. And they've only audited like 30%. I believe, of the nursing homes. So the state of Minnesota is very behind. I introduced an amendment to have us have private audits done so that we could get caught up. So we're paying nursing homes on a fair market value of actual costs timely, but the majority party voted no. So we have to use the state of Minnesota. They're behind, and by the time they get the cost reports done, they're getting reimbursed on rates that were 2 years ago. So we all know the price of eggs are not what it was 2 years ago. And so that's part of the problem. So the credit lines have went out. They can't increase their credit lines anymore. And so many of them are just having to stop taking, when you stop taking admissions, you have no way to pay your payroll. And right now, that's what a lot of them are doing, and they're closing. They're just saying, we can't be in this business anymore.
So more funding for nursing homes, and you've advocated for that. And now we're at the end where it's really come down to choices, and we have a budget surplus.
Correct.
And the budget surplus is both one-time money and ongoing money. And as we've explained on the show before, it's really the ongoing budget surplus is a smaller portion of the surplus, but that's more like your paycheck. And this one-time money is more like if you got a bonus. You can only spend it once, but you can't count on it in the future. Yep. So Representative Zeleznikar, then, where would you want to take the money from to find the money to go to nursing home funding? And I know you mentioned a couple of projects just now, but those are one-time dollars. You know, spending on the rail up here, some of the zoo funding is one-time money, but you're, I think, looking for ongoing money for nursing homes. So where would you make that choice? Because those big pots of money are education, taxes, human services, and so where would you find that money?
Well, right now, the one-time money would be very critical, and we have $1.7 billion we're putting into the Paid Family Medical Leave Act, which is going to increase what we do above the federal 12 weeks, which all the businesses are calling me daily saying this is an issue. So that's a pot of money. We're making a choice to start a new program that supersedes federal law.
But you wouldn't want to spend that on nursing homes that need an ongoing need, because then they would be in deficit
Correct.
2 years from now.
So, but the money that they need right now is the one-time money would help tremendously, because they have a reimbursement, a value-based reimbursement, which the state did a few years ago, which they are reimbursed with costs. The issues are we need to get the cost reports done faster so that we're reimbursing them on actual real costs. They did not put inflationary adjustments like they're doing in education and all the other government programs. They chose to not do that with nursing homes. And so the tails are really, we're behind. So the one-time money would have helped tremendously. And then we need to look at the reimbursement structure on the model, which is very complicated. That's not going to get done by end of session. So I think people understand we might need one-time money right now, and then we need to look at the audits, getting the cost reports done so we get reimbursed, and look at inflationary adjustments. And that's going to take a couple, many meetings, quite frankly, next year to look at what we can do for nursing homes to stabilize them on a long-term basis.
Senator Rarick, we have somebody who's worked in the field and is fluent with the details, but I love your comments on long-term care and nursing home funding.
Yeah, I think, when we saw the targets come out, we knew right away this was not going to be able to meet the needs that we've been hearing about for a number of years now. And, Senator Hoffman, he chairs the HSR committee in the Senate, and we have been working with him. The Senate Republicans have trying
and that's
to
the Human Services Committee. We're
Correct.
acronym free here. We try to be as much as possible for the viewers. So,
yeah. So we've been working with him trying to kind of figure that out. And I think it is a combination. There's some one-time funds that are needed right now to help our nursing homes, but you're right. There's some long-term, the in the tails money that's needed. And so, and I think a number of people believe, we'd have liked to have seen some tax cuts, but they also understand that that is a need that we have to have. I think one of the things we see in the education realm right now, we did record funding towards education out of this, but yet we're putting new mandates on that are actually going to exceed the new monies. And I think if we could have avoided that and actually done away with some of the things we require of our schools, we could have taken some of that money and shifted it to our nursing homes, and our schools would have still been in a good spot. So, I think it's a lot of things that we're looking at here that, I would have loved. I talked at the beginning of the year, I was talking to folks, coming out of COVID, we've heard from teachers, we've heard from the nurses, we've heard from long-term care folks. It's all this paperwork and some of the requirements that they have to do. I'd have loved to have seen us do like a 2 or 3 year moratorium on that to say, let's get everybody caught up. Let's forget about that for a while, and then we can reevaluate how much of that is actually necessary, and we could get rid of some of that administrative cost that's not actually helping our students in the classroom, our seniors in nursing homes. Let's get back and focus on those things. And so I hope that's some of what we talk about as well in these next session, off session, next session, things like that. What can we do to actually put that focus back into the care and into the education system?
And we're going to talk much more about education as the hour goes along, but I want to stay on this line around long-term care, some of these cuts, and in the Senate, and really tie this back to the capital investment or bonding bill. And as a reminder for viewers, this is the bill where the state traditionally borrows money to invest in capital projects. And so this would be roads and sewers and buildings that the state or regional entities own. And so this year there's been a conversation because when you borrow money, the legislature has to vote in a supermajority to borrow money, not just spend money, but borrow money. And so the Senate Republicans have withheld their votes on a bonding bill and tied it really to tax cuts for Social Security, rebate checks, maybe some of this long-term care funding. There's been negotiations back and forth. And some people, I think, see this and they say, well, that makes sense. You have leverage, right? They need your vote for this bill, so we're going to ask for other things. While other viewers might be saying, this is what I don't like about politics. Why can't every issue stand on its own? If you want a bonding bill, you vote on a bonding bill. If you want nursing home funding, you want nursing home funding. And so why tie the two issues together? Do you think that's a good idea? And where do we stand right now?
Yeah, I'm somebody who believes too we put too many things into one bill and vote it through, but even though they're not in one bill, there are ties to everything, just like your own budget, right? You might say, hey, I've got to think of everything on its own, but yet it all comes together in the end, because if you do too many things right away and you come to something important, you may not be able to afford it. So you have to look at the whole scope, and that's the Senate Republicans, what we've been doing. And we heard over and over that with a $17 to $19 billion surplus, tax cuts were something that people absolutely wanted and believed were coming. And rather than a rebate check, some type of tax cut, so we're not sending checks out, because then we have administrative costs to go with that. And so that's what we've been saying. It's like, hey, we need to make sure we can't just spend the entire surplus and then borrow more money. We should have tax cuts that will go along with borrowing this money so that Minnesotans can continue to afford this. And that's not what has happened. So right now, where we see the targets, the tax cuts are probably not likely to happen, but it is some of the nursing home funding or some of these other things that we are looking at saying, if we, instead of using the cash in the bonding bill, what are the things that we think are most necessary for that money? Because all along the process so far this year, as being in the minority, we haven't had the say as to where things go in this. So this is our one piece of leverage to try to help direct where some of this funding will go. And I think Minnesotans kind of expect that, because it's like, instead of having one party making every single determination, let's have a little bit of everybody working together. I think that's what they expected. We've heard that over and over as well. We need to work together. We need to have agreement on things. And so far that hasn't happened. And I think in the last few days we can get there on a bonding bill, but it's going to take that. Let's talk about this, come to some agreements, because I want to see these projects get done as well. It is very important. I've heard from those in construction, we're slowing down now. The jobs would be great. All this water infrastructure, repairing of state assets, that's all important stuff. But again, it all goes together. If we increase our spending by, spend all this $19 billion, have nothing left in the bank, plus we borrow more, I'm really nervous about what we're coming back to next year, where it's going to be deficits. We have all this money that's been borrowed. Now we might start having to make cuts from education or from HHS, the Health and Human Services. That's what I'm really nervous about. So let's take a good long look as to why we're spending all the money and then borrowing more. Let's take a more balanced approach, is what Senate Republicans are doing.
So couldn't you say the same thing, though, about the tax cuts that you're supporting, is that would also impact the surplus as well and put you in that same position that you're saying about if you commit more spending, that impacts the surplus, right? But if you if you cut more taxes, that also shrinks the surplus as well and puts you in that same position that you were talking about, saying, well, we don't want to have to go backwards and spend all the money. And so, spending it is one way to shrink the surplus. Tax cuts shrink the surplus as well. And so why is it a better strategy to do tax cuts, which could put you in that same situation of being in deficit soon, which you have just said you didn't want to do?
Well, early in session when we were looking to do the targets, that's when we were really focused on more of the tax cuts. I think right now we're realizing with what's already been spent, the tax cuts other than the Social Security, that's when we're still focused on. Not likely to happen to be able to afford things. But one of the reasons we believed early on a bigger target should go to taxes is we saw it with all the COVID relief money that came out. When people have money in their hands, they spend, and then we see an increase in sales tax revenue. So that really is what has driven some of this surplus, especially the one-time surplus, was just that that people were spending money. And when we go into a recession and people don't spend as much, we start to see less coming into the state. So it's and I know that's one of the disagreements sometimes on economics, what's the better method, keep more money in people's hands and the state sees more, or keep the tax revenue coming in through income taxes and things like that. It's one of those arguments. I believe that more money in people's hands keeps the economy going more, and then the state sees benefit from that through sales taxes.
Well, we're going to stick on taxes. A caller from Duluth is wondering the current state of the state tax on Social Security income. We have a sense of where it is. Representative Zeleznikar, you've been here 3 times. This question gets asked every time we're on. I think we have a sense of where it's going to shake out, because there seems to be, the majority parties seem to be somewhat in agreement on where they stand. Representative Zeleznikar, can you give us an update on where we stand on Social Security tax cut?
I mean, my position has always been that Social Security tax should be eliminated for everybody. They've already been taxed once. And I think, those that are in the higher income, as defined right now by the majority party, that there's value in them staying in Minnesota. And so if they are taxed when other states are not taxed, they don't have to stay in Minnesota. And so when we lose them, we lose all their spending, we lose all their investing, their volunteerism, all that they give in various organizations back to the community. So my feeling is it's important to all. I think my general belief right now is the majority party is going to have somewhat of a Social Security tax elimination, and it's going to stop at a certain income level. And Senator Rarick could probably talk about that, but I think that's probably what we're going to see.
Yeah. Do you have a sense on what the numbers are?
I don't remember the exact numbers, but they're saying it's about 76% of the people, and it's about 26% of the actual revenue, income tax revenue that's going to be dealt with. So it's good, but as Representative Zeleznikar said, it's we're looking at a number of people, right? They maybe winter in Arizona, or they winter in Texas, or they winter in Florida, and they're really starting to make that decision of making that their permanent residence and staying down there longer so that they avoid that tax. So that's, again, that balance. What are we looking at is by not eliminating their tax, are we in the long run actually going to be worse off and bring in less here? And I believe that's the case, that they're not spending as much here. We're not bringing in that revenue through sales taxes, and if they move completely, we're losing their property tax. Hopefully somebody else moves into the place and that continues, but especially if they make their residence in another state,
correct,
then they'll pay a little bit higher property tax here. All of that makes their decision as to whether they stay here at all something they're really starting to ask.
Final numbers that I've seen thus far, and I think it's still tentative, it's not a done deal yet, but individuals making $70,000 and below and families making $100,000 and below, I think is where it sits right now, roughly, but they'll have a final answer in the next week and a half. Next question, and we'll start with you, Senator Rarick. Can you give us an update on where the cannabis legislation is? And so this would be recreational cannabis use for adults.
Yeah, so right now it is in conference committee. So the House passed one version and the Senate passed a different version, and they're working on those differences to come up with the exact same bill to go back to both bodies. So, That's not been something I've been willing to support. I know we had a number of Republicans who during the campaign said they would support it, but the bill that came forward to the Senate, actually there wasn't one Republican who voted for it. I've been hearing from my small cities, they're really worried that they're not going to have as much local say as they want to be able to regulate it like they can with alcohol within city limits.
So they can regulate right now how many establishments can sell liquor, and in this proposed legislation, anybody can sell cannabis?
Yeah, and I think that's still in the House version. In the Senate version, they did concede to some of that, and so there are some provisions to help give a little bit more local control. I know they're still concerned. Our county sheriffs have continually been opposed to this because we don't have a way to test for somebody who's out on the road if they're under the influence or not. And just, I think one of the things too, so many people talk about, well, we can use the revenue for schools and all these other things. It would be so great to get that revenue in. But when we look at the state of Colorado, their numbers that they're talking about now is for every dollar that comes in on their cannabis, they're seeing $7 to $8 in increased costs in their Health and Human Services department. So it's not a revenue generator for the state. I wish we'd have waited a couple more years, maybe not been in the 20s for doing this, been more in the 30s or 40s, so that more of the bugs have been worked out and we've seen more of the ramifications of it.
Anything else to add, Representative Zeleznikar? We've talked about this in weeks past, but as the days go on, thoughts and feelings?
One of the things, we offered an amendment on the House floor for 25 years old, and that was based on the fact that the child psychologists that have been at many of the children and family committees and other committees stated that the brain development is not complete till 25 years approximately, and that marijuana and cannabis strengths are very high, and it has a different effect than alcohol, and we know how alcohol is processed. So, the perspective was, what about 25? And that was shot down. So, we're just going to wait and see. I haven't seen the language either on the final, to Senator Rarick's point. It's in conference committee, but the concerns are real. I mean, there's valid concerns, and the interest, or the tax rate is very low on this, so there's not a profit for Minnesota. It's expected to be a break even, and actually I see it being a cost to Minnesota because we are going to have further issues with children probably.
Yeah, and that, another thing that came to mind then is, the potency. This is not the marijuana from the 60s and the 70s that we're talking about, and I know that's some of the discussion, putting some type of a cap, because you can bring that potency level in the labs way up, and that is something too that law enforcement and just a lot of people are concerned about. You hear the statistic that no one's ever overdosed on marijuana. It's actually starting to happen because of these high potencies, and so hopefully we'll get some type of a limit put in there on that if this is going to come through. But that's another thing. We're not talking about the same marijuana from the 60s and the 70s. So
I'll just have to take your word for that. So sounds like both of you voted against it and probably not supporting in the future. However, for the caller and the viewers at home, what do you think the likelihood of it passing this session is then?
It'll pass.
It'll pass.
They will come up in this next week with some type of agreement in conference committee, and so it will pass. But the exact details are yet to be determined.
Next question, caller on Duluth wants to know where you stand on Nurses at the Bedside Act. Representative Zeleznikar, you want to start with that and explain maybe what the legislation is first for some viewers who might not be familiar with it.
Sure. Nurses at the Bedside Act is all about specifics on how many patients a nurse is taking care of and staffing ratios. And I've ran nursing homes for the last 30 years, and so I understand 24-hour operations, and I understand what the ask is. I've also been a patient with breast cancer with 8 surgeries, so I understand the role, and nurses have a tremendous role to play in patient outcomes. They're the fundamental one. The importance of the physician is without a doubt, but the nurse is there. I think the challenge becomes, and the intentions I think are sound very logical, and we want to have safety. I think it's very difficult to put regulations, and I've seen that in the nursing home side too, is when you write rules very tight, it doesn't give you the discretion to look at somebody's experience and how long they've been a nurse, and are they a new grad, are they what's their specialty, what's their experience thing, and what can you handle for scope on patient load, because it is different and there's variables that happen day to day in 24-hour operations. And so my concern is you have to be very careful on what you try to accomplish as a goal, because the domino effect is creating 10 other issues that are the unintended consequences of what something sounds so good. And it sounds perfect in what the ask is, but the consequences, I think, will have unintended consequences that haven't been fully thought out right now. And so we have to really have people at the table to look at, how do we accomplish the goals? How do we do this, and how do we make sure that we have reasonable regulations, appropriate mandates, that the funding sources are coming through, and find a way to support nurses. Supporting nurses is very important to me. And I've always believed in that, and it's a critical piece in patient care, as are the nursing assistants and the bedside and the housekeepers and all of this. But when you put ratios in, there's another implication that happens, that if you haven't been on both sides of it, have been a nurse and been in administration and understand some of these dynamics, sometimes you don't understand the whole picture. And I think we have to just get people to the table to be looking at, how are we going to accomplish things to meet the needs of great patient care? We're coming out of a pandemic. And so, and making sure that we use the talents of our nurses to the best of our ability. And, the needs in pediatrics and the needs in oncology and the needs across the board are all varying. So it's a very complicated issue. And I think there's just going to be a lot of discussion. I would like to see more discussion. I don't think of running to mandates as always the answer. I've seen that happen. We're really good at mandating, and we don't solve a problem.
So the act itself, though, would set up committees.
Correct.
And it would have nurses and the hospital administrators at the table to have this discussion about how many nurses, this ratio issue that you're talking about. So that's at the crux of really what the bill is when you boil that down. Is that correct?
To my understanding, yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Senator Rarick, your thoughts on this, and as we talk here, the nurses are strongly supportive of this, passing this legislation.
Yeah, as a trades union guy myself, I understand that, but there are some things that I believe belong in that collective bargaining position and not dictated by state statute. And this is one of those, because I believe you can collectively bargain and work towards things, but yet then still have that flexibility for situations that arise, where if it's in state statute, that flexibility no longer exists. If there's suddenly a wave of something that happens in a community and you have to turn people away because you can't meet those ratios that are stated in state statute. So that's one of my concerns that I have with putting that into state law. The other thing we've heard now from, Mayo Clinic is talking about, billions of dollars that they are going to stop with investment here in Minnesota if this passes, to feel out, well, what is going to happen. And I think ultimately what we're looking at it, and it's not just nurses, but this shortage all throughout the industries of workers. And I serve on higher ed as well, and we've looked at a number of these areas that are very, very short in people working, and nursing and care is one of those areas where we are targeting grants to get people into the education system to be able to get into those fields. And that's more of an approach that I feel is appropriate, because if we can get more people in, we alleviate that burden.
Pressure.
And now we're meeting what those ratios are that the nurses are asking for. But right now, especially if we put this in state statute, the nurses just aren't there to meet it. We will probably see closures of small rural hospitals. We will see empty beds and people will be turned away because they just can't meet those ratios, and people won't get the care that they need. So in the long run, this is about getting more people into that field so that we can relieve the pressure that's been put on the nurses over these last 4 or 5 years.
These are great questions that the viewers and callers are sending in. Please keep them coming. We're going to transition to education. We finally have somebody sitting at the table who serves on the education committee, and you already self-disclosed it's your first year on the job serving in that committee. Can you expand a little more? I know you talked a bit about the mandates. It seems like the most significant portion of the budget surplus, the ongoing budget surplus, is in the education funding part of the bill. It seems like that bill is all wrapped up basically and ready to go with a few details needed to be ironed out. But where do we stand on the education bill, and what's in it, what's to like about it, and any concerns you have?
Yeah, well, as the bill is in conference committee. Unfortunately, I'm not on the conference committee, so I'm not sure of exactly what the details are. I kind of know what came through the Senate version. But yeah, a little over $2 billion of the ongoing was dedicated to the Education Finance Committee. Record amount of spending for schools. And we've been hearing from our schools, they're been falling behind. So I think this was an opportunity to really help our schools out in their areas around special education. That's a federal mandate that they have to provide those services, yet the federal government has never followed up with the amount of funding that they've promised. So the school districts have always fallen behind. They call it a cross subsidy. We're looking at, and the plan in front of us is looking to help with some of that. I believe about 40%, well, what came out of the Senate was 40% in the first year, 47% in the next year, and then 60% ongoing. We're also looking at a formula increase. And one of the things that I don't agree with, and actually was not in the Senate plan, I know the Senate chair doesn't agree with either, is that tying to inflation. I believe that sets up an expectation to the schools that they're going to get that. And like I said, if we come back with a deficit, they actually could be doing their plans saying, well, this is what we're going to get now, when in reality that's not what they're going to get. So if we just leave it and not tie it to inflation, their base would still be there, which is always at risk as well, but they won't be looking at that increase, and they'll be waiting to set their budgets until they know what their increase is. And I think that's a better way for our schools to be able to operate so they don't get into a hole. But when we look at, there are a number of requirements within the education bill, some new requirements for graduation, different things like that. But their big concerns are really the paid family leave that's coming through. In the labor bill, there was another piece that would put into collective bargaining the staffing ratios and classroom ratios. Those are the things that I'm hearing from superintendents and school boards that really have them nervous, and that when they've calculated what the increase in spending will be on the formula and the special education cross subsidy, but then what it's going to cost them to do the new mandates, it's going to cost more than what the new funding is going to cover. So we'll actually be putting our schools into a deficit with so many of these new requirements. So we're just missing the boat on this education spending. I think we should have, again, the record increase in spending would have been great had we done nothing to ask them to have new requirements so that they could get caught up. Our kids are behind in reading, math, and science. And this is not going to allow our schools to focus back into the classroom and get our kids caught up. They're going to be focusing on all these new requirements and how to implement them and make them work.
So we've heard a lot about the mandates potentially that are in this bill in weeks past. So I think I'm hearing you state two: paid family medical leave, and then putting ratios into the collective bargaining agreement. Are those two of the larger ones? Are there other ones? Am I right on that? I just want to make sure.
Correct. Those are two of the big ones. And then I also know one of the other unfunded when unemployment insurance for like the bus drivers and the lunch workers, the hourly workers at the school. When the bill first came forward, it had the state creating a fund that the schools would then draw off of to cover the costs that they had for providing that benefit. But when the bills came to the floor, that was out. So now the school districts are all responsible for that cost as well. So those are the big three that they're looking at, saying, these are new expenses that you're putting into the school district that this new funding will not cover. Again, with some of the changes of, addition of curriculum that they're going to have to do. These are all things that they're looking at that is just going to generate time, administrative costs, things that aren't going to go into the classroom, that they're going to fall further behind.
So before I get to Representative Zeleznikar on this, one follow-up question then. The second mandate you spoke of is these ratios in collective bargaining. Isn't that what you were arguing would be a good thing for nurses to keep it there? So why is it a bad thing to have the collective bargaining, the ratios in collective bargaining for the education portion?
They're looking to put it into state law, that it has a requirement to go into the collective bargaining, which they already do, but they're saying that you have to come to an agreement of what the exact numbers are, is the way the legislation was written. The way it's done right now, which I believe is the right way, is that the teachers union and the school district can talk about, and here's what the goal is. But again, I can use Pine City as the example where I went to school, all the way back to when my parents went to Pine City. At the elementary level, you have 4 classrooms per grade level. Now, if we set into state law that we have to come to an agreement on a specific number for what the class ratio is, and one class comes in that's bigger than all the others have been, and you miss it, and now that class has to have 5 classrooms, what does Pine City Elementary do? They don't have the 5th classroom. Now they have to go find the teacher, and that's going to follow that class all the way through. And is it the best scenario to have a larger class? It's not, but the cost that would be involved to make that happen just is beyond what the school could manage. So even though it's bigger classes, you're still going to maintain 4 classrooms per grade, even for that larger class. And that's the flexibility that we've heard from our school boards and superintendents that they have to have. And if we put it into state statute that they must come to that agreement, that becomes the problem.
Representative Zeleznikar, thoughts on the education funding bill?
Thank you for the question. It's a great question. I think education is a cornerstone for all of us, and to Senator Rarick's point, I mean, I just went to Proctor's school 2 weeks ago and looked at the trades and saw the house that they're building on the campus with the electricians, and you and I talked about how important this is with trades. And I think it's short-sighted that we're looking at these tiers, eliminating a tier in education, when that was a bipartisan thing that we did as a state to allow teachers to have another pathway in education. And there's, I think, 27 teachers that are in the northeastern part of Minnesota that are teaching in culinary arts and shops and media, and whether it's Rails TV and broadcasting like what we're doing right here. And all those programs are going to be at risk when we have a teacher shortage of teachers that may choose not to go back to get their 4-year degree, who have tremendous experience. I met them, 20 years of experience as chefs and cooks, and we've built great programs to get kids involved and engaged and to give them pathways. And I think that the districts are very concerned. And to Senator Rarick's point, the unfunded costs with the mandates that the state has put together on unemployment with the bus drivers, and my own mom was a bus driver. And so, but the colleges now we're going to be paying unemployment for all these people at the college level, at the higher ed, the same thing in K through 12. And then we're having mandates that aren't funded. And that is exactly what I thought we would get away from this session. Let's fully fund education to what we need, not put them further in the hole. And what I can see from every superintendent that's sending to me is the math does not add up. We're going to end up doing cuts. We're going to end up doing layoffs. We're going to end up having fewer classes for kids to be able to pick, because if they mandate these licensures, which is the path that we're going right now, we won't have somebody to fill the slot. We're already in a teacher shortage. So my perspective is it's disappointing.
So I've heard from both of you about the challenge that you see in mandates coming from the state onto local districts and local control being an important issue. Though I've also seen amendments and legislation introduced banning a certain type of teaching in the classroom, which in of itself would be a mandate as well. And so why would it be okay? And one example I can give is something that's been deemed critical race theory, but is about teaching different histories of different cultures and ethnicities. So on the one hand, why is it okay to ban that, which is a mandate, or to support banning that, and then come out against other mandates in education? Shouldn't local control prevail all across the board or not? Representative Zeleznikar, I'll start with you.
Thanks, that's a great question. And I think that wouldn't have local control. It'd be a Minnesota Ed mandate from the state. So on your question on ethnic studies, it's adding another class, so which class are we taking away? And that's the question. So that becomes the crux for education, is what are we taking away when we have kids not reading at 50%? I was hoping we would focus on phonics. Let's get the basics here. Let's teach what we already have and close the gap, because we had kids out of school for 2 years and doing distance learning. And so why would we be adding another class when we have to take away something, when we have gaps in math and reading the classes that we have right now. So that's my position, is it's another mandate, which means you have to, there's only so many hours in the day. So what are we taking away from the kids? Is it the college classes? It can't take away reading. We need more reading. And so that's, I think, the concern.
Yeah, the local control to me is where it belongs. And I know we had a couple of amendments in the Senate that were trying to get at that. And there's always somebody who offers the amendment, again, just saying at the state level this should be banned. And that's not what I support. Mm-mm. That's allow the parents working with the local school board to make their determination. But that's a critical piece as well, that the parents have to be allowed to be involved in that process. So that their input is being considered. But yes, the local level is where it should be, and that's where I wish the state would back off on some of these requirements that we've put around education, and that's something I'm hoping to work on over the next couple of years while I'm on the education committee. Is there a pathway to kind of separate that? Because so many of these requirements are, it's great for that kid who's going off for a 4-year degree, but someone who's going for a 2-year program or into the trades doesn't necessarily need that. They need to be able to take that shop class, or they need to be able to take that extra language class. And how can we maybe separate that and create those pathways so that they can get the things that are most desirable for them, that's actually going to lead them towards where they're going, instead of putting in all of these requirements saying, man, if you've got these 3 levels of math class, you're going to be prepared for college when you're not going to college. So, these are all things that I think that the state can back away a little bit on those requirements. Each school board and the parents together can work on that and say, here's what we want our school focused on, and here are the things we want to work with. And that's what I'll support. And again, I know those amendments come forward, and I don't like them and I don't support them.
So one could argue, though, that the state and the country is getting more and more diverse racially and ethnically, and there could be value in teaching the histories of cultures and traditions and not allowing community by community to decide what is history and cultures and tradition, but having a uniform standard so that everybody can be taught that in the state. What's wrong with that?
There's nothing wrong with that, but what does matter is the words on the page. Mm-hmm. And when I looked at what was in this bill, and I spoke with the gentleman who came forward with the proposal, and we had a disagreement as to what it said, but like under the ethnic studies, the one piece, he was claiming that the language said, we should be able to teach just that. If with what Martin Luther King Jr. did, his accomplishments, what he contributed to society, should be allowed to be taught in the classroom without fear of, repercussion or being told you can't do it. The way I interpreted what was on the page, though, was that anybody in a protected class could develop curriculum for the classroom, and the school board couldn't ban it. And that's a big difference than talking about what your contributions to society were. So that to me becomes one of those things. It's not just about coming up with an idea and saying this is great, it's about making sure that the language that you put in the proposal and in the bill actually state that. And so I would absolutely support saying that if, sometimes you go against what you said, but this is, there are times where in a local area you're not doing something right, so you put kind of that overarching requirement saying, well, if you want to go down that road, you can't say no to this because it's something that is beneficial. But you don't require that it has to be in there, which is another thing that this bill does. It's saying throughout all of your curriculum, you have to take this into account and apply it and work it into your existing curriculum. It should be, does the teacher want to? Are they capable of? And if they do want to, you can't tell them they can't.
So, and I'll pitch it to you a little differently, Representative Zeleznikar.
Sure.
Say we leave it up to parents and families and school districts, and they just don't decide to teach about who won the Civil War. Is it that local community's decision, or once again, kind of back to what Senator Rarick and I were talking about, there should be some standards that the state sets, and that's an appropriate role or not?
I hear what you're saying. I understand the question. I think we want to teach history. I think my position is doing things, though, that unify us as the human race. How are we going to unify us as Americans in a public education system, and making sure that when we're teaching, that we come through a lens of unifying and not dividing. We can teach history, and there's all kinds of facets of history. And then history of yesterday isn't today and won't be our future. And I think there's a trajectory that it has a place with all history, but teaching is layers of complications and also great opportunities. And so I think some of those details are going to get worked out, but I think that's what parents want, is to make sure that piece is there, that their child, wherever they live, whatever the zip code is, has the opportunity to be unified in their classroom, to have their needs be met, and somebody else's child be met. And we have all different ancestries in Minnesota and in the United States right now. And so I think everybody agrees history is important. I think it comes down to making sure, though, that we unify children, that we don't make any group of children feel like they're not valued and they're not important, and we don't want to inspire them to be the best they can be, all of them. And so, I try to look at opportunities to speak as, how are we the human race right now? And, I can't rewrite history to the good or the bad, but I can do my best to try to unify children and adults. And I think it's important. And history is going to be a very important part of all of our conversations going forward.
And we have some bumps in the roads in history as well, and teaching that
we do.
Might not necessarily unify people at times, because there's some difficult issues there.
Yeah.
So,
and we don't all agree, and that's okay. But we can have conversations peacefully and go through the differences and the different lenses. And I think that those opportunities take place in various levels of education at different paces, whether it's college classes or community ed or elementary and high school. It's in different chapters of life, but they all happen in different formats, and depending on what your teacher experience has been, some are phenomenal, and we have a lot of opportunities. So I think we'll see where it all goes.
On another topic on education, higher education, let's talk about. Now, Senator Rarick sits on the Higher Education Committee as well, so he might be a little more versed on this. So I'll start with you first, Senator Rarick. That bill is all wrapped up, and there's agreement on it, and I think some of the major highlights that at least I'm aware of is any family who makes $80,000 a year or less, individual, will have college paid for. So they won't have to pay to go to college. They'll have to cover room and board, but the actual college will be paid for. And there's enough funding in this bill to freeze tuition levels at our Minnesota state schools, and significant funding to the University of Minnesota. The state cannot freeze University of Minnesota, and we won't get into the details on why that is, but significant funding in there. Those seem to be kind of the bigger highlights of the bill. What are your thoughts on the higher education bill?
I was pretty outspoken being opposed to this plan. And I've used the school that's in my hometown as an example, the Pine Technical and Community College. Dennis Franzen created a foundation, and then there are others that have done some other foundations. They have figured out how to, in the private side, offer free school. And so there's about 6 or 7 school districts in our area. If you graduate high school from that school, the Franzen Foundation will cover your tuition at Pine Tech. You still go through, you fill out your FAFSA so that you get your Pell grants, you get any state grants, but then anything that's left at the end, they will cover. And that, to me, is the way it should be done, that those final pieces should be done by folks in the private sector trying to figure it out and help out. So I'm not in agreement of the free tuition coming from the state, paying for that. I am a big advocate in higher education for the state grants and expanding those and helping students out according to their need. Because when we do the state grants, the lower incomes get a higher amount, and then as your income goes up, you're getting less and less and less. And then you're also able to use that wherever you wish. This program is only available at the Min-State system and at the University of Minnesota. So if you have somebody here in Duluth who wants to go to St. Scholastica, they can't use it there. But that might be where the program is offered that they really want and need to get to where they want to go. So that's why I like the state grant system. It works in conjunction with the federal plans, the Pell grants, things like that. And then I've been trying for a couple of years now to push this idea to, help people understand what the Franzen Foundation has been doing at Pine Tech and replicate that around the state at different schools to get that last dollar in for students and getting people like you and me to contribute and help people out.
Thoughts on the higher education bill?
I could not say it better. I mean, I totally agree with Senator Rarick. I think I've heard from a lot of families say that this sounds great, but they feel that it also limits people that are dual income. Most people, if both people are working, are making $80,000. Many couples make $80,000, so their kids aren't going to be eligible for this. So then they said, what do we do? Just resign? That takes people out of the workforce. So your kids get to college level, then do you think about one person not working while they're in college so you're eligible, so your child is eligible? And it assumes that every parent is able to, that your parent's income is indicative of who's helping you pay for college. And I think that's a falsehood too. Not all kids are going to be in the situation where their parents' income is the pathway for if they should be able to get any help. And that's why I like the grant structure for people going to college, and for whether they pick the trades or they pick the 4-year degree, to get them on a pathway and to support them on that, and then to look at them having choice. This is a lockstep, no choice. Unless they do X, they're not going to get any money. And so those are my concerns.
Is that true? You cannot get grants if you're under $80,000 a year then? I mean, the grant program is still...
Right, that particular one. So you're still going to get, again, this is kind of following that thing. You have to fill out the FAFSA, so you're getting the federal Pell Grant that you'd be eligible for, you're getting the state grant that you would be eligible for, and then this picks up that last piece. So that's the other thing that I struggle with this, because I don't remember the dollar figure, but basically it's somewhere around that, somewhere between 45 and 50,000 family income. You're basically already getting the free tuition through the Pell Grants and the state grants. So we've looked at it, we've run the numbers. There's about 15,000 students statewide that this is going to apply to and help. Where if you did it in the grants, it's well over 100,000 students that you're actually giving more assistance to. So that, to me, is a much better use of that $117 million, because you're spreading it out, you're helping more people, and then you're allowing for, like, the Franzen Foundations and other things like that, all these small towns that have scholarships, now they're coming in and helping make up that last piece instead.
But there are still grants available to students. I just want to be clear about that.
Correct, and they do have a little bit more that went into the state grant system in this bill as well, just not as much as I would have liked to have seen with the target that the committee had.
Great. I think we're going to only have time for maybe one or two more questions, and folks have been sending them in. Viewer from Grand Rapids is writing in asking about back to the capital investment bill and or transportation bill. Any legislation looking to fix roads and the upkeep, specifically any of the existing budget surplus going to be dedicated to help funds available for local city governments to allocate towards road repair and those sorts of things. Where are we at on that? Representative Zeleznikar, we'll start with you and then over to Senator Rarick.
There's a lot of money in transportation. There's a lot of money. I think the money for the townships and the money for the roads, the bridges are something that, I've always supported those pieces. I think it's common sense. We get potholes quite often up here, and so people know we need help on that, and so that's not an issue. In the transportation bill, I've been pretty straightforward. I do not like the train from Minneapolis-St. Paul. I think $146 million is not what we should be doing right now when we have safety issues in Minneapolis-St. Paul on the current train system. So there's pieces in there, and we'll see what happens as we move forward with this bill. But I think we're going to see money for sure to the townships and some of those other pieces to get that done. I think we're going to see Highway 61. We've got to get the construction project through there. There's many towns that we're going to have issues, and roads and bridges and all that is in there without a doubt. It's just what other things are in there too.
Minnesota has 5 seasons, construction season being one of them. Senator Rarick.
Yeah, there is a good chunk of money in transportation, some of the one-time money. I don't know what the final will be. I know there was talk early on on the Senate floor, talk of $1 billion that was going to go right into roads. Now, what I would also like to see is that as the legislature, we would earmark some of that to certain projects. When we leave that up to MnDOT, I've not always agreed with where they go with that. I know in my district, folks have been looking at Highway 73 to get repaired and rebuilt in this one stretch, around Cromwell. And they've had the money allocated and taken away a number of times over the years. So I'd love to see that get an earmark for some of that. And I know other folks around the state, would like to, and that doesn't always meet MnDOT's requirements or what the projects that they choose. And then I do believe there is some money in there that's going to be dedicated to our small cities and townships. Again, it's not as much as I think we've talked in the past about the dedication of auto part sales taxes, which would allow for more to be dedicated. That's not in this bill, but there will be a fair amount of spending for transportation infrastructure.
Okay, well, I only have time for one more question, and it's going to be a quick answer, hopefully, from each of you, about 10, 15 seconds each. The legislature is going into its last week and a day. You're going to be done next Monday, one way or another, not this coming Monday, but the following one. There's been talk about getting done early, even, this legislature. Your thoughts and predictions, Senator Rarick, are they going to get done early or going right till Monday?
We'll go till Monday midnight. We always do.
All right. Representative Zeleznikar, your thoughts?
Ditto. I don't think we haven't seen conference committee reports back. We have not seen it yet, and we have a lot of conversation to do. So I think we'll be going till Monday. We'll go right to the end.
All righty. Well, appreciate you both being here today. And we are out of time. I would like to thank Representative Natalie Zeleznikar and Senator Jason Rarick for joining us today. This is our final edition of Minnesota Legislative Report for this season. I'd like to thank the crew here at PBS North, Nick, Kieran, Layla, Erica, Peter, Greg, and Claire for their work putting this program on the air each and every week. And thanks to you, the viewers at home, for calling in and your emails, all your questions, and for playing a vital part in our representative government system. For the team here at PBS North, I'm Tony Sertich. Have a great evening.